The morning air was cool, carrying the faint smell of freshly baked bread and roasted coffee beans from the small cafes that lined the busy street. People walked quickly, their minds focused on work, errands, or the rush of everyday life. Among them, a young man walked slowly, carrying an old guitar case that had seen better days. His clothes were simple, a little worn, but he walked with a quiet determination that made him stand out. Even if no one noticed at first, Dottie stopped outside a small cafe, watching people laughing and chatting as they sipped their drinks. The warmth from inside spilled out into the street through the open door, inviting and comforting. He took a deep breath, then opened his mouth, his voice barely louder than a whisper. "Excuse me, can I play for a coffee?" For a moment there was silence. Then came the laughter. A few people smirked, whispering to each other, "For a coffee? Really?" Others didn't even look at him, hurrying past without a second thought. He felt a small sting in his chest, but he didn't let it stop him. He knew what he could do. He had spent years playing in empty rooms, practicing when no one was watching. Learning how to make his music speak louder than words, he opened his guitar case and carefully placed it on the ground. The case had scratches and dents, but it had a history, every mark a memory, every worn string a reminder of the hours he had spent learning, failing, and trying again. He strummed a few chords, simple at first, testing the sound. Feeling the vibration under his fingers, people continued to pass by, some glancing at him briefly, some shaking their heads, some sneering. A woman with a stroller muttered something about kids and street noise, while a man in a business suit walked by without a glance. The young man felt the weight of their judgment, but he also felt something else, a spark of hope. He knew that music had a way of reaching people when words could not. Then he began to play. Not a complicated piece, not yet, just a melody that had been living in his head for years. It was soft and gentle at first, almost shy, but it carried something that caught the attention of a few passers-by. A teenager paused, headphones hanging around his neck, and nodded slightly to the beat. A barista glanced out the window and smiled, intrigued. One by one, people slowed down, drawn by a sound they hadn't expected to find on a busy city street. The young man closed his eyes and let the music flow. He remembered the nights he had spent alone in his room, imagining what it would be like if someone actually listened, if someone actually cared. And now, here he was, on the edge of the street, a worn guitar in his hands, and the small beginnings of an audience forming. It was not much, but it was enough. After a while, a kind customer came to the window. She held a small cup of coffee and set it on the ledge, giving him a nod. "For you," she said. "Keep playing. You're good." The young man felt his heart lift. It was a small gesture, but it meant the world. He smiled, thanked her quietly, and continued to play. The laughter from before faded into the background. The music was louder now, not just in sound, but in feeling. He wasn't playing for attention or fame. He was playing for the joy of it, for the chance to touch someone else's heart with something he loved. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. People came and went, some stopping for a moment, some leaving without a thought. But every note he played carried a piece of him, a story that no one could ignore if they really listened. And in that moment he realized something important. Talent and passion could not be measured by how many people laughed at you or how small the reward seemed. Sometimes the smallest stage could hold the biggest magic dock. As the day went on, he packed his guitar back into its case, feeling tired but happy. He knew this was only the beginning. The street would still be full of busy people tomorrow, laughing or ignoring him. But he had something no one could take away, his music. His courage and the small victories that came from simply asking, "Can I play for a coffee?" With one last look at the cafe, the young man walked down the street, ready to find another corner, another chance, another moment to let his music shine. And though the city moved on around him, oblivious to his struggle, he carried a quiet confidence. One day they would not laugh. One day they would stop, listen, and maybe even be amazed. The next morning, the young man woke up before the sun had fully risen. The city was still quiet, with only a few early risers moving along the streets. He carried his guitar case carefully, feeling the familiar weight in his hands. It was comforting, like an old friend reminding him that he had something valuable. Even if the world had yet to notice, he walked toward the same cafe as yesterday. The smell of coffee and baked bread was stronger now in the cool morning air. People were beginning to trickle in, some carrying newspapers, others talking on their phones. He hesitated at the corner, remembering the laughter from yesterday, the way some people had mocked his question. A small doubt crept into his mind. What if they laughed again? What if no one stopped to listen this time? But he pushed the thoughts away. Yesterday had taught him something important. He could not let the judgment of others stop him. He set his guitar case on the sidewalk and carefully opened it, strumming a few gentle chords to warm up his fingers. The first notes were shaky, betraying his nervousness, but he kept going. Music had a way of pulling him in, helping him forget the fear. Even if just for a little while, people walked by, as they always did. Some barely looked at him. Others glanced curiously but kept moving. He tried not to let it bother him. He began to play a soft melody, simple and calm, filling the street with a sound that made people pause for just a moment. A few heads turned, not out of mockery this time, but because the music caught their attention, a young girl stopped, holding her mother's hand. She tilted her head, listening closely, her eyes wide with curiosity. The young man smiled softly, noticing the way she reacted. It reminded him of why he loved playing music in the first place. It was not about fame or money or approval. It was about connection. The small moments when a sound could reach someone's heart. A few more people began to slow down. A man carrying a briefcase set it on the ground for a second, listening to the melody as if it had brought him peace in a stressful morning. A woman walking her dog paused, letting the dog sniff the air while she quietly watched. Each small gesture felt like a tiny victory to the young man. The street was beginning to change, not drastically, not yet, but enough for him to feel that his music mattered. After a few minutes, a small crowd began to form. None of them were large or imposing. Just ordinary people drawn in by a song that felt familiar, yet new. The young man's confidence began to grow. He closed his eyes and let the music flow, experimenting with soft variations in rhythm and melody. His fingers moved faster now, not because he wanted to impress anyone, but because he was truly lost in the music. One of the cafe staff came to the door, watching him with curiosity. "You're back?" she said quietly, a small smile on her face. "I liked your music yesterday." "Keep it up." The young man nodded, feeling a warmth in his chest. Encouragement like this was rare, but it reminded him that even small gestures could mean everything. He didn't say much, words were not necessary, he simply played with a little more freedom, letting the music tell the story he could not put into sentences. Soon. A few people who had laughed yesterday stopped by again. They lingered at a distance, curious to see if the young man's music was really as good as some had suggested. He noticed them but did not falter. In fact, he played with even more heart, letting every note carry his determination. The laughter from before faded away. Replaced by the faint murmurs of interest, a passerby dropped a few coins into the guitar case. It wasn't much, but it was enough to show appreciation. The young man's face lit up in a small smile, a quiet acknowledgement of the small victory. Music, he realized, was more than performance. It was about giving people something they did not know they needed, a moment of beauty, a brief escape from the rush of life. Hours passed. The street began to fill with the normal rush of the city, people talking, hurrying, laughing. Yet, amid it all, the young man continued to play. Each note he struck was infused with a mixture of nervousness, hope, and courage. Every time someone stopped for a moment, nodded, or smiled, it reinforced his belief that he could make a difference. Even in small ways. By midday, the crowd had grown just a little more. Not everyone was interested, but enough were drawn in to make the young man feel that he was no longer invisible. A group of teenagers sat on the steps of a nearby building, nodding to the rhythm and whispering excitedly among themselves. A couple leaned against the cafe window, quietly tapping their fingers along to the beat, and then it happened, a small, unexpected moment that he would never forget. A man, older and dressed in neat clothes, walked slowly toward him, stopping right in front of the guitar case. He did not smile, he did not laugh. He simply stood there and listened. For several minutes he didn't move, didn't even nod. But the young man could feel the man's attention, the weight of his focus. It was more than recognition, it was respect. When the song ended, the man reached into his pocket and left a generous tip in the guitar case. He nodded once, a quiet acknowledgement that spoke louder than any words could. The young man's heart swelled. This was not the applause of a crowd or the flashing of cameras. It was real, genuine, and it meant more than he could have imagined. As the afternoon sun climbed higher, the young man finally packed up his guitar. He felt tired, but also filled with a quiet joy. He had faced the street, the laughter, and the doubts, and he had not given up. He had shared something he loved, and it had touched others, even if only a few. That was enough for today. He walked down the street, carrying his guitar case carefully, feeling the warmth of the city around him. The people who laughed yesterday were still there, rushing past, busy with their own lives. But now something had changed. The young man was no longer invisible, and deep inside he knew that this was only the beginning of a journey that could surprise everyone, including himself. Music had given him courage, and courage had given him a chance. And as he disappeared around the corner, ready to find another street, another cafe, another small audience, he carried a quiet hope that one day they would not just stop to listen. One day they would be amazed. The next few days passed quickly, each morning blending into the next, but the young man's determination never wavered. He returned to the same corner outside the cafe, carrying his worn guitar case, and set it down with a careful hand. The city had a rhythm of its own, cars honking, people talking, dogs barking, coffee smells drifting into the air, and somehow, in the middle of it all, his music began to find its place. Today. However, he decided to try something different. He had been practicing late into the night, experimenting with new melodies and combining them with rhythms he had never played before. He wanted to surprise himself and maybe, just maybe, surprise the city as well. He started softly, the same familiar chords that people had begun to recognize. Slowly he added variations, small twists in rhythm and melody that made the tune feel alive. At first, the crowd that had begun to gather barely noticed. But as he played, something began to shift. The music grew more confident, more intricate, as though it had a voice of its own. People walking by stopped, some out of curiosity, others out of sheer amazement. A group of office workers leaned against the building across the street, coffee cups in hand, their conversation fading as the melody carried over. Even the teenagers sitting on the steps yesterday had returned, now leaning forward, captivated by the change in his music. It was different, unexpected, yet strangely familiar. There was emotion in every note, joy, longing, and something deeper, almost unspoken, that connected with every listener. One passerby who had scoffed at him just days before froze in place. The man's laughter had vanished, replaced by astonishment. He couldn't quite believe what he was hearing. The young man's fingers danced across the strings, each movement precise yet effortless, revealing a talent far beyond what anyone had expected. The young man's eyes closed, his mind fully immersed in the music. He was no longer playing for coins, attention, or approval. He was playing because he could, because this music had been inside him all along, waiting for the right moment to be heard. The notes rose and fell, twisting into melodies that felt larger than the street itself, as though the city had become an instrument in itself. Responding to every strum, more people began to gather, forming a semicircle around him. Some held their phones, not out of mockery this time, but to capture what they knew was special. A mother held her child close, letting the baby's eyes widen at the sound. An older man leaned on his cane, nodding slowly, a small smile on his face. Everyone seemed to sense something rare, something that transcended ordinary street performances. Then came the moment that would define this day. A young woman, sitting on the cafe steps with a notebook in her lap, whispered to her friend, "He's incredible." "I've never heard anything like this." That simple statement carried through the small crowd, spreading like wildfire. People stopped talking, phones were lowered, and all eyes were on him. The young man began to play a more complex piece, one he had been hesitant to try in public. The notes intertwined like a conversation, full of subtle emotions that tugged at the hearts of the listeners. Some closed their eyes, letting the music take them somewhere else entirely. Others opened their mouths in silent astonishment, as if realizing that something extraordinary was happening right before them. The once empty street now thrummed with energy. Every laugh that had met him before seemed to vanish into the past, replaced by gasps of amazement and whispered praise. "He's so talented," someone murmured. "I can't believe it." Another voice said, "Where did he learn to play like that?" But the young man did not hear the questions. He didn't need to. The music itself was speaking louder than words ever could. Coins and bills began to appear in his guitar case, but for the first time he barely noticed. Money had never been the goal. This was something different. This was respect, curiosity, admiration, emotions that no one could give through sarcasm or laughter. He had turned ridicule into recognition, doubt into fascination, and in the process had transformed the corner of the street into a stage that mattered. Time seemed to slow as the young man continued to play. People lingered longer than they expected. They didn't just pass by, they watched, listened, and absorbed every note. Even the cafe staff came out to stand at the doorway, watching him with open admiration. A barista whispered to a coworker, "I think we've been underestimating him all along." At one point, a small child ran up to the edge of the crowd and clapped along to the rhythm, laughing. The young man smiled softly, glancing down briefly, letting the melody embrace that moment. Music had this power to make strangers connect, to spark joy, and to remind people of something they often forgot. Wonder dawned as the sun began to climb higher. The young man noticed that the crowd had grown larger than before. People were sharing their excitement with others passing by, gesturing and pointing, spreading the word without even trying. What had started as a humble attempt to play for a cup of coffee had become something alive. A small miracle on the street. By the time he ended his performance, the applause was real and spontaneous. People cheered, clapped, and whistled. Some even shouted words of encouragement. The young man opened his eyes, feeling the warmth of genuine appreciation wash over him. For the first time, he allowed himself to fully accept it. He had earned this moment not through luck, but through patience, courage, and the simple act of daring to play. The crowd slowly began to disperse. But the young man stayed for a moment, strumming softly as he packed his guitar. He looked around at the faces that had stopped to watch, some amazed, some smiling, some thoughtful. And in that brief silence that followed, he realized that this street, once a place of doubt and laughter, had become a place where his music mattered. He knew he had only just begun. This was more than a performance. It was a turning point. The world could laugh or doubt, but he had discovered the truth for himself. Talent, when nurtured and shared, could touch anyone, anywhere. And sometimes the quietest people, the ones underestimated and overlooked, could leave the strongest impression. As he walked away from the cafe corner that day, guitar case in hand, the young man felt something he had never felt before, a quiet pride and a renewed belief in his own abilities. The city had witnessed his genius, even in small doses, and he knew that this was just the start. One day, the laughter would be gone, replaced by awe. And until then, he would keep playing, one note at a time, letting his music speak louder than anything else. After the day his music had surprised the crowd, the young man's mornings changed in subtle but exciting ways. He still carried his worn guitar case and walked the familiar streets, but now there was a difference in the air. People began to recognize him. Some waved, some nodded, and others paused for a second longer to hear the first few notes of his music. It was no longer the same street where he had asked, almost shyly, "Can I play for a coffee?" Now, it felt like a stage, and he was beginning to step into it with confidence. The first sign of real change came when someone held up a phone to record him while he played. A teenager in a hoodie smiled and whispered to a friend, "We should put this online." Within hours, the small clip was shared, liked, and commented on. People were amazed at his talent, and the video began to circulate beyond the street, reaching places the young man had never imagined. Despite the growing attention, he remained humble. He didn't chase likes or praise. His goal was simple, to play music that mattered, that reached people in some small way. Every coin that dropped into his guitar case, every compliment whispered or shouted, reminded him that his music had power, not because of fame, but because it connected with others. One afternoon, a small group of people gathered in the street. They weren't just passers-by this time. They had come intentionally, curious to see the musician who had captured the attention of the city. Some brought friends, some filmed quietly, and a few even brought snacks or small drinks, offering gestures of kindness that surprised him. The young man felt the strange but wonderful feeling of being seen, really seen. For the first time, then came an invitation that took him by surprise. A cafe owner approached him, holding a cup of coffee with a warm smile. "Would you like to play inside?" he asked. "We'd love for our customers to hear you. We can even schedule a small session." The young man blinked, unsure what to say at first. Inside? Real tables, chairs, real listeners? It was more than he had dared to imagine. He nodded slowly, feeling both nervous and excited. His first indoor performance was small but unforgettable. The cafe was cozy, with a few people sipping drinks, the sunlight streaming through the windows and the smell of pastries filling the air. He placed his guitar carefully and began to play. The music sounded different indoors, richer, warmer, and somehow more intimate. People listened with undivided attention. A few whispered to each other, amazed at the skill and emotion he poured into every note. After the session, a young music blogger approached him. "Your playing is incredible," she said. "Would you mind if I wrote about you? People need to know about this." The young man hesitated, then nodded. It was strange to think that someone wanted to share his story, that his music could reach even more people than the street allowed. Soon, the recognition grew. Local news outlets mentioned him in small features. Social media shared his performances, and more people came to see him play, whether on the street or in the cafe. Each time, the young man stayed grounded. He never let attention distract him from the reason he had started, love for music, and the joy of sharing it. More importantly, his music began to inspire others. A few teenagers brought their instruments to play alongside him, shyly at first, then with growing confidence. They didn't always get it right, but the young man encouraged them, teaching small tips and smiling at their progress. He realized that music wasn't just about performing. It was about helping others find their own voices. Even strangers approached him with stories. One woman, who had been passing by during his street performances, shared how his music had helped her through a difficult morning at work. Another man said that hearing him play reminded him of his childhood piano lessons, long forgotten. Each story, small as it might seem, strengthened the young man's belief that music could touch lives in ways no one expected. The young man's life was beginning to change, but not in the ways people might expect. There were no luxurious concerts, no contracts, no fame chasing him down. Instead, he found something more valuable: respect, genuine connection, and the chance to grow both as a musician and as a person. Every day, someone stopped to listen. Every day, someone left with a smile. And every day, the young man realized that the laughter from before was no longer important. What mattered was the difference he was quietly making. One afternoon, as he played near the cafe, a small child ran up and clapped excitedly. "Play that one again," the child shouted, laughing. The young man smiled, strumming the same cheerful melody. He noticed how the people around responded, the young, the old, the busy, the hurried, all stopping for a brief moment, sharing the magic of music together. In that instant, he understood that his journey was about more than recognition. It was about creating joy, even if only for a few minutes at a time. By the end of the week, he was invited to play at a local community event. It was not a huge stage, but it was official, and it carried a sense of respect that made him both nervous and proud. He practiced tirelessly, refining the pieces he had improvised on the street, adding layers of emotion and expression he had been experimenting with quietly. For the first time, he realized that his talent, once hidden and underestimated, was beginning to shine in ways he had only dreamed about. The event itself was small but full of life. Families, neighbors, and friends filled the park, curious to see the young man who had been quietly captivating the city streets. As he played, he noticed eyes widening, heads nodding, and hands clapping along. Some people whispered to each other in amazement. A few even came up afterward to thank him personally. The young man felt the warmth of genuine appreciation once again, but this time it was amplified. After the event, walking home, he thought about the journey so far. From the first hesitant question, "Can I play for a coffee?" to the recognition he had received today, it had been a path of small steps, courage, and persistence. He realized that life often underestimated quiet determination, that even small gestures could lead to something far greater than anyone imagined. Music had opened doors he had never expected. Not through luck, not through connections, but through sheer effort, heart, and the willingness to keep playing even when the world laughed. He knew there would still be challenges, skeptics, and days when people ignored him. But he also knew that his music could now reach hearts, inspire others, and even change the way people saw him, not just as a street musician, but as an artist, a storyteller, and someone who dared to dream. That night, as he rested in his small apartment, he strummed his guitar quietly, reflecting on the week. The city outside buzzed with its usual chaos, but inside he felt calm and confident. Recognition was wonderful, but more important was the joy of doing what he loved and the realization that he had begun to make a difference. Music had not just brought applause. It had brought connection, hope, and the beginning of a new chapter in his life. And as he drifted to sleep, the young man felt a quiet certainty. The world was just starting to see what he could do. And one day, they would not just stop to listen, they would be inspired, amazed, and maybe even changed. The young man woke up early, feeling a mixture of excitement and calm. Over the past weeks, life had changed in ways he had never imagined. From a street corner with a worn guitar and a small question, "Can I play for a coffee?" he had begun a journey that no one had expected, including himself. Yet, even with recognition growing and opportunities opening, he remained the same person, humble, passionate, and deeply connected to his music. Today was different, though. He was invited to perform at a larger local event, one that had real stages, lights, and a larger audience than the streets or cafes he was used to. For a brief moment, he felt nervous, questioning whether he belonged there. But then he remembered all the mornings walking the streets, all the laughter, all the small coins and kind gestures. He remembered the faces of people who had stopped to listen, even for a moment. That gave him courage. When he arrived at the event, the space was buzzing with energy. Families, friends, and music enthusiasts filled the area, chatting and laughing. The young man carried his guitar carefully, placing it on the stage as he took a deep breath. This was not just a performance. This was a moment that reflected weeks of persistence, dedication, and quiet courage. As he began to play, the familiar feeling of nervousness disappeared. His fingers moved naturally across the strings, his melodies flowing freely. But this time, something was different. He could feel the audience's attention, their curiosity, and their genuine appreciation. The music filled the space, touching hearts in ways that no applause or praise could fully capture. Every note told a story, every rhythm carried emotion, and the audience responded instinctively. Some swayed, some closed their eyes, and some smiled quietly, feeling a connection they couldn't explain. After a few minutes, the crowd erupted in genuine applause. It was louder and more heartfelt than any street performance or cafe session he had experienced. People cheered, clapped, and whistled, some recording the moment to share with others. The young man smiled softly, bowing slightly, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. This wasn't just recognition for talent. It was acknowledgement for courage, patience, and the ability to keep going despite doubt and laughter. After his performance, several people approached him. Some shared how much his music had inspired them, how it had brightened their day, or reminded them of moments they had long forgotten. Others asked questions about his journey, wanting to know how he had begun, how he had kept going, and what had motivated him. Each story, each word of appreciation felt like a small reward, a validation that his music had meaning beyond himself. A few local musicians came up to him as well, offering encouragement and the possibility of collaboration. He realized that his quiet persistence had not only brought him recognition, but had opened doors to opportunities he had never imagined. He could play in larger venues, create new compositions, and even help inspire other aspiring musicians who were waiting for someone to show them the way. Later that evening, after the crowd had dispersed, he walked through the now quiet streets, guitar case in hand. The city felt familiar and strange at the same time. Familiar because it was still the same streets, cafes, and corners where he had begun. Strange because it had changed in small ways. People noticed him now, smiled at him, nodded in recognition, or waved from a distance. The laughter that had once stung seemed distant, almost forgotten. He thought back to the very first day he had asked for a coffee in exchange for music. He remembered the laughter, the dismissive glances, and the doubts he had felt. And he smiled. It was strange to think how far a single question, a simple act of courage, had carried him. Music had been his voice when words were not enough, and now that voice had reached others, leaving a quiet impact on the world around him. That night, he returned to his small apartment, placing the guitar carefully on the stand. He strummed softly, reflecting on everything that had happened. Recognition, applause, social media attention, and invitations to perform, these were wonderful, but they were not the reason he had begun. The real reward was the connection, the ability to touch hearts, and the courage to keep pursuing what he loved even when the world laughed. He thought about the people who had stopped to listen over the past weeks, the young girl with wide eyes, the office workers who had paused their busy day, the kind stranger who had left a generous tip, and the small crowds who had shared their smiles and appreciation. Each person had reminded him why he had begun playing in the first place, to share a piece of himself through music, and to make someone's day a little brighter. In that quiet moment, the young man realized that his journey was more than just recognition or fame. It was about resilience, passion, and the small choices that add up to something remarkable. One question, "Can I play for a coffee?" had started it all. One small act of courage had grown into a journey of discovery, growth, and connection. He picked up his guitar one last time for the night and played a melody that felt like a story, a reflection of all he had experienced. The music was soft, warm, and full of emotion, carrying his journey from the streets to the stage, from laughter to respect, and from doubt to triumph. It was a story not just about talent, but about the courage to pursue a dream, no matter how small or uncertain the beginning. As he put the guitar down, he felt a sense of peace. The city outside was quiet, lights twinkling in the distance. He had started with nothing but a question and a guitar, and now he had recognition, connection, and the knowledge that he had inspired others simply by staying true to himself. He knew the journey was far from over. There would be new challenges, new stages, and new opportunities. But he also knew that he had already achieved something rare. He had turned doubt into admiration, laughter into respect, and a simple dream into reality. And so the young man closed his eyes, letting the music linger in his mind, feeling gratitude, pride, and quiet joy. He had dared to ask, dared to play, and dared to keep going. One day, he thought, when he plays again, the audience will not just stop and listen, they will be amazed, inspired, and perhaps even changed. And that, he knew, was the true power of following your passion and believing in yourself, no matter what anyone else says. The street, the cafe, and the city had witnessed his journey. And in every note, every smile, and every quiet gesture of appreciation, he realized one truth: dreams can start small, with courage, patience, and a single question. And if you dare to play, even for something as simple as a cup of coffee, you might just surprise the world and yourself.